Well, welcome to Digit Debates before the summer starts. My name is Jackie O'Reilly, co-director of the Centre, and I am absolutely thrilled today to be able to welcome Marius, Achim, Kees and Paul in absentia to talk about their new book, Digitalization, the Future of the Welfare State. And one of the reasons I was particularly pleased that they agreed to come and talk about this new book is that when we were looking at the terrain of work on this topic, there are at the moment very few books that actually comprehensively try to cover a range of issues of how digitalization is affecting the way different types of welfare state services are being delivered, and how this creates new types of risk. And this relates very well to some of the work that we're doing here at the Centre, but they have a very particular take on it around issues around risk and how that's being measured in different countries. So I'm really pleased to welcome you all here to tell us about your book last year. And with no further ado, I'll just hand over to you to present it now. And all the details of how you can access the book and all the bios of how brilliant they all are, which they are all available on the website as part of the event. So thank you very much for coming. And who's going to talk first?
I think that would be me. Just a second, I need to make sure that the power.
Any of you have questions throughout while we're waiting for the slides to come up, you're welcome to put them in the chat, or and I'll pick them up at the end. Great, Achim.
Just 1 second. I hope this should be fine, the view. Excellent. So I'm sharing the screen now. Thank you very much, Jackie. It's great to see you again after such a long time. It's my pleasure to introduce the book to you. As Jackie already mentioned, unfortunately, Paul, our fourth co-author, couldn't be with us, but I think he sends his best wishes, and I hope that we also give his share of, or his view of the matter here to adequate detail. Marius and Kees will also join the discussion soon. I will just kind of summarize the book, which is difficult because it's an edited volume, but I try my best. And then we also would like to dedicate the last part of the talk. So basically there's a first half talking about the book mainly, and then there's a second half when we talk about a little bit our current research agendas to see also where we are heading in the future, or in actually what we are doing right now, essentially. So Digitalization and the Welfare State is the name of the book. It comes with a kind of a backlog. So maybe we start with some facts about this. It contains 21 chapters by a total of more than 30 authors from very different countries. We are mainly looking at European and North American, or let's say OECD countries, and we adopt a comparative perspective. But we also thought it would be nice if not all kind of chapters are the same, since we are dealing here with things that are very fastly moving, very quickly evolving, and because of that we wanted to adopt a specific perspective that is also to a certain degree forward-looking, perhaps even somewhat more speculative. So it's a bit of a mixture between current day typical research, public opinion data, etc., but it's also a little bit more playful in certain ways. We mainly rely either on comparative case studies or some, as I already mentioned, quantitative studies, for instance, on public opinion data. And we also try to be interdisciplinary, so there's not only political scientists, but also sociologists and education experts and so on. Represented in this book project also some economists, and perhaps very importantly, the book actually started way before pandemics, so we kind of were hit midstream in the whole process. So it was also interesting as an ongoing project to see whether we would have to change a little bit some of the things we have been writing. And of course, there's, as Kees will also finish right now, he will also highlight that there's, of course, new technologies, new trends. So a book always is kind of outdated in the very moment it's getting published here. But I think some of the findings will have longer lasting relevance here. So I mean, this is a little bit too detailed, but here are the contributions. You see, we have a bunch of introductory chapters, especially the one by Marius might be interesting, the second chapter, because it's kind of a state-of-the-art report on some of the key questions. Then we have a part 1, which looks at kind of the broader trends. And then we have a part 2, which really talks about the implications for politics, and a part 3 that talks about implications for policies. Of course, this cannot be neatly or strictly separated, but we have this idea that we're looking at both parts of welfare state discussions, both when it comes to content of policy areas, but also political processes. Yes. Okay, then let us first think a little bit about what we were aiming to do. We had a relatively broad definition in mind of technology, including digitalization in a broad sense, but then of course also picking up topics that are very important in welfare state analysis and current day socioeconomic questions, such as the platform or gig economy, but also processes of automation, and also a little bit of algorithms, artificial intelligence. And as I already mentioned, we had these 2 main questions. One was really about digitalization, broadly defined, and its effects on the policy space. So what changes will we observe or might are already happening in various policy areas, from education to health to other welfare state areas. And then we have a second bunch of questions that look at the politicization, if any, of digitalization in this regard. So we have kind of 2 dimensions here in the book. One is the evolution over time, where we start in the introduction looking at this debate whether this time is different. You know, the world has been called clinically deaf many times, but the question is whether, for instance, technological change this time really brings a completely new world, as some people have suggested, or not. And we will come back to this, whether it is true or not, but on balance, there might be something to this. And then, of course, the second thing is also especially when you look in a cross-sectional, cross-country perspective, you see that a lot of things are actually under discretion of political decision-making, and that there's a lot of variation, not only politics narrowly defined, of course, also the institutional setup of countries and welfare states also matters. So this is a little bit the 2 types of variations we are going to talk about in the book. Now, this is, as I said, it's an edited volume. It's a bit hard to see, but I tried my best to visualize this somehow. So we have a big shell, which is the frame, the introduction, the state of the literature report by Marius, and a conclusion part where we try to basically give the bigger frame. And then we have different types of contributions. Some are more conceptual. For instance, Marius and his co-author, they have a more often speculative, forward-looking perspective on the types of new jobs, new activities that might be created by digitalization. But there's also this more traditional forms of case studies, comparative, usually talking about things like pension systems, education systems, and so on. Then we have some more quantitative, or sometimes inferential, sometimes descriptive forms of analysis on a macro level. For instance, Torben Iversen and Philip Rehm have something like this, which is also in part conceptual. So I put this a little bit more in the middle. So these little letters here, by the way, if you're thinking what I'm showing here, are the acronyms of the author's last name. So BG, for instance, would be Busemeyer, Glassman, and so on. So this is just showing you where a little bit the different contributions lie in our kind of spectrum. And then we have some micro level contributions, usually about public opinion. But for instance, myself and Stefanie Gast-Cepeda, we work more with content data So we are somewhere in between. And the thing is also, the book also doesn't only have different methodological perspectives, but it also looks at very different technologies. For instance, we have several papers looking at the platform economy and what this implies in, for instance, for the social domain, for policy making, for trade unions, and so on and so forth. We have a whole bunch of papers talking about automation, but we also have some papers that talk about digitalization more broadly. And then we have a bunch of contributions such as Iversen and Rehm, for instance, and others that look at algorithms narrowly defined. So what this actually does to the social fabric. And Paul Marx, for instance, also has a contribution on this. And finally, we have different topics here. Welfare state regimes broadly defined. We have some contributions. We have some contributions on the policy areas themselves. And as I already mentioned, some contributions more working on a micro level, public opinion. Now, with an edited volume, the fascinating thing is always that there's points of agreements and there's point of differences in opinion. This wouldn't be the first book probably where you find both. And so I try to plot this a little bit, and it's really hard to generalize. So some of these authors, again, to the little, the letters here represent authors or co-authors, basically, in the same logic here. And I didn't put everyone because some of them were hard to put, and maybe some of the authors would even disagree with my assessment. So this is also tainted somewhat subjectively, but to give you a little bit of a feeling also what kind of discussions we had in the book, writing workshops we had two of them. And it's fascinating that there's actually also a difference in opinion. So not everybody was totally agreeing with the fact that there's really something fundamentally new to this. So for instance, people like Werner Eichhorst, Anton Hammerreich, and Gemma Scalis, they were not so sure in their contribution how much of a difference this really makes, and whether the welfare state undergoes some fundamental challenges, especially because these authors are well known also for their ideas about social investment. So for them, this is just another shock that follows similar patterns of absorption, if you want. But again, of course, for instance, Iversen, Rehm, Paul Marx, and others, they are much more seeing very genuinely new emergent phenomena that can hardly be reconciled with what has been going on so far. So Paul, for instance, talks about this insidious nature of social media and algorithms and how this leads to mental distress and kind of eroding the social fabric on which the welfare state is even built upon, and so on and so forth. So there is a bit of a debate among the authors in what sense this is really new, in what sense this is something old, and then of course also whether this is actually everything is bad, let's say, or whether there is also some more positive aspects. So Marius perhaps can later on also talk about his own contribution, but there in their contribution there is also something like a potential for creativity in the online economy here. And Georg Picot, for instance, is also a little bit more sanguine on the real size and the impact, for instance, gig work and the platform economy will have in mature welfare states, let's say. But of course, there's also the more pessimistic accounts who would say, yeah, there's really something going on. So the algorithms might undermine the social solidarity mechanism on which, for instance, health insurance is based upon, and so on and so forth. So it's quite fascinating to see that it's not a major bone of contention here. So it's not that we are at loggerheads, but there's different varieties to the theme, perhaps. That might be the best thing. And of course, there's some common findings as well. So even the most optimistic contributions would say there's quite some challenges here in various sectors when you think about gig work, when you think about algorithms, and so on and so forth, especially in those areas where we undergo kind of new trends that haven't been seen very much so far. So, I mean, one thing is automation of industrial production, which is actually not such a new thing, and it might now spread into kind of activities we haven't really considered feasible for automation before. But the other thing is really something like AI that kind of creates a whole new dynamic to this, right? And as I already said, politics matters. There are several contributions where this becomes very clear. For instance, Jackie just mentioned why Estonia is so much advanced in many ways of electronic administration, and Buhr and Frankenberger, for instance, in this edited volume, they look at health systems and how they adjust to digitalization. And it's quite obvious that the UK or Estonia are much more proactive in digitalizing the administration of the welfare state even, right? Whereas others see this more as a shock from outside to which they need to react. And Germany might be a better example of modernization as something coming from outside because the industry needs it or something like that. And finally, this is probably now not so important anymore, but at the time of writing, we were, as I said, we were hit by a shock, which was the COVID crisis. And then we discussed a little bit in the conclusion also why we believe that this was rather sort of a catalyst of some sorts, because it led to this tremendous spread of online platforms, of online tools, for instance, in education. So it's kind of, yeah, as I said, some sort of catalyst. Now the book ends with a bunch of open questions, and I think some will be introduced by Kees and Marius in a minute. But we admit also in the book, as I said in the beginning, this is of course a very dynamic field. So at the time of writing, for instance, ChatGPT was not a big thing, or so of course we had something similar, but the dynamics are really so explosive that it's hard to see what's going on here. And so there's some areas in the book also which couldn't be covered, or which we might have wanted to cover, but for lack of space or so, we were a little bit weaker, let's say. So data governance is clearly an issue that pops up in some of the contributions, but could have perhaps highlighted even more. And also what this means for the future of work in more general. These are fascinating lines. So this is also the reason why we are currently working on some extensions. I'm only going to mention one of the three I mentioned here. One is about non-OECD countries, then Marius and Kees will take over. Perhaps very briefly, because this comes in my line of research, I'm always straddling the OECD and non-OECD work in my own research. So I'm currently doing kind of a similar project, but for emerging markets or middle income countries, if you want. So we pick, so we kind of do a nested research project or a nested design here. We are looking at 3 countries in particular, but we're also looking at a larger data set for all countries for which we find reasonable information, and look at the processes. So how do the actors involved, for instance, perceive technological change? How do what is public opinion like? We have much less data for these countries, so we are kind of crafting a survey of our own, and then we do some mini case studies, mini vignettes on different sectors, because these countries usually are not the first ones that come to mind when we talk about digitalization. But actually, if you look carefully, the projections are very similar, even sometimes more drastic of sorts, right? So it's fascinating to see this also from a global political economy perspective. So this is what we are currently working on. For instance, we did, as a kind of a trial run with a co-author, we did a field survey in Ghana. And then we realized that actually discussion looks quite different from European countries. Perhaps not surprisingly so, but it's still interesting to see. They see new technologies really as, for the moment at least, much more beneficial than harmful, right? So whereas in Europe you see much more skepticism, in countries like Ghana, there's more optimism. It's kind of a positive productivity shock, if you want. And we also did something similar in Mexico. This is really something which is fairly new. But just to give you a bit of a flavor, we do a bunch of focus groups with key stakeholders in the debate, you know, kind of trade unions, academics, politicians, or people working in public administration, to see what they think about the topic. And it's quite interesting to see that there is quite a sort of a disagreement, but there is also kind of a frenzy, a hectic activity that is now happening, because some of these things now also hit hard in these middle income countries. I can talk more about this if there's some questions, but I think I would leave it at that and rather give my co-authors more time and opportunity to also share some of their more recent findings. So I would like to hand over to Marius.
Yeah, thanks a lot, Achim, for this and also for the invitation. Of course, I'm very happy to be here virtually, so to speak. One of the aspects that I've been working on since the publication of the book, and that I plan to continue working on in the coming 2 or 3 years, is this link between technological change, automation risk, and policy preferences. So what kind of social policies do the people want that are mostly affected by technological change, either objectively speaking or because they perceive themselves subjectively to be affected by this? We have a rather big project on this topic here in Constance, and funded by our excellence cluster, the politics of inequality. I have also new survey data from that project, but for this 5 minutes that I have here, I decided to focus rather on things that we have done before, because we're still analyzing our new data. And this is, but the basic research question is quite similar. So this is a paper that came out in the Socioeconomic Review last year, a joint work with Tobias Toba, Mia Gantenberger, and Carlo Knotz. And we have a similar paper or parallel paper in CPS, Tobias and me. And for these papers, we use data from the OECD Risks That Matter survey, where we had the chance of including a few questions on digitalization and technological change in the 2020 wave. And it covers 25 OECD countries, 25,000 respondents. So it's very comprehensive. You can go on to the next slide, please. And here is a measure of subjective risk. So this is basically asking people how worried they are about losing their job due to replacement by robot, computer software, algorithm, or AI within the coming 5 years. It is a subjective perception. We're also working on a paper with our own survey, because it's not possible with the OECD survey data here, to what extent subjective perceptions and objective risk are associated, and that's actually a question by itself. But for now, just notice that there's quite a strong cross-national variation in how the extent to which people are worried about technological change, and that in some countries, Korea, Turkey, Mexico, Chile, these worries are really cover basically the majority of the population. People are less worried in the more encompassing welfare states like Austria and Finland, Norway, but even here more than 20% are worried. Next slide, please. So then in another part of the survey, we asked them what kind of policy responses would you prefer in response to technological change. And here we don't force them to make a choice, so they can basically say yes to everything, but you can see there is some pattern here, or there is some variation in support. So this is just the share of the respondents who say who agree or very much or support or strongly support the different policies. And the most supported policy options would be number A and B, basically social investment, right? So it's investing more in university education, vocational training, further training. This is supported by large majorities. Least popular, interestingly, is the introduction of a tax on robots or technology companies. A little bit difficult to explain. Maybe it has to do just with the word tax, and people just don't like taxes. But then we have other things like investing more in digital infrastructure. That's option C. Introducing limited or reduced working hours. There's option E here, and it comes out as a rather popular policy option also in our own survey data. And then finally, options F and G. F is basically compensatory social policies to expand unemployment benefits, and G would be the introduction of a universal basic income. So these are also decently popular, but not as popular as social investment. But more importantly, of course, if you go to the next slide, is now the question of how the different things hang together. So what we do in that paper now is to devise do a factor analysis and see identify basically 2 factors that can explain where the different items are loading on. And the first factor is, we call it compensatory or protective policies. And this is, the robo-tax, work-sharing arrangements, social protection, universal basic income. So it's a little bit broader than just compensatory social policies. It has this protective angle as well. But it differs clearly from the first or the second factor, which is social investment policies, which are the first three items essentially. And here you can also see that this varies to some extent across countries. But we're focusing more on explaining the micro level variation in this specific paper. If you go to the next slide, you can see the individual level determinants of support for social investment, the gray dots, and compensation. This is the dark gray dots. And the most important finding here is right at the top of these figures, namely that subjective technology risk is positively associated with support for compensatory policies and negatively associated with support for social investment policies. So in other words, high-risk individuals perceive them rather would like to see more compensation and not necessarily more social investment policies, even though the latter might actually be more effective in mitigating this problem in the long term. So this is also a little bit of a question of short-term need for compensation versus long-term investment needs. We see the reverse pattern for heavy technology users. So this could indicate that there are winners and losers of technological change. The winners demand social investment, the losers compensation, and that's the contours of a potential new cleavage in that area. The difference between the left and the right-hand side is that the right-hand side includes some additional control variables on the macro level, but basically the micro level story stays the same. So maybe just moving on, and then even one more. So if we can jump to the next one, and then the one after that. This is the interaction between technology use and risk. I'm not going to talk about that. Yeah, I just wanted to say that's the parallel paper that I mentioned that came out in CPS recently, where we forced people to prioritize between these 5 different policy options. And it makes it more complicated to model, statistically speaking. But the added advantage here is, of course, that you really get a more robust estimate of people's preferences. And I'm happy to talk more about this in the Q&A. If you move to the next slide, I don't have time to go through all of this now in detail, but basically what we can see here is the same picture as before, namely that high-risk individuals demand more compensatory policies and vice versa. And you see this emerging potential cleavage between the winners and losers of technological change as well with this kind of data. So that's in a sense reassuring that it's a very robust finding, but on the other hand, maybe a little bit troubling in terms of the policy implications, because if as a policymaker you want to increase funding on social investment and education, you may not actually be doing the kind of policies that those people that are mostly affected by these changes actually demand. And that shows a potential political dilemma for policymakers. Okay, that's it from my side. And now Kees is taking over.
Yes, thank you. So what I would like to do is actually go back a little bit to what Achim has been saying, but also to the conclusion of our book. And the 2 things that we noticed there, that we, as was already said, that we recognize that there actually is still a limited impact of technological change in labor markets, at least by some stressed by some of the authors in our book. But that there are indeed all kinds of things that we see happening that are a bit more fundamental and have impacts on the policies and politics of the welfare state. And our position was that this time does indeed seem to be somewhat different. We were not very radical. Move to the next slide, please. And we had all in the conclusion also 2 scenarios, one positive and one negative, just to reflect that we have these various views in the book. Obviously, the positive one where actually technological innovation helps policymakers to do good things for the welfare state, and a negative one where they are actually too late or incapable of doing anything and we are facing the negative consequences. So the next slide. And then ChatGPT happened after the book was published. And then, of course, we go back to the idea what it is that we're seeing. Are we seeing something really, really different this time? Or is it the same story that we have some optimism and positive views on this? But I think the two things that we already noted in our book was that one of the characteristics that is special about technological change is the fast-moving pace, which makes it very difficult to keep up, both politically and in terms of policies. And then with if you see, these are just some headers from newspaper journal titles for articles, right? For instance, the one on ChatGPT broke the EU plan to regulate AI. So there is regulation in the making that deals with some of the stuff that we talk about in the book, but actually it doesn't really is not able to cope with what ChatGPT actually can do. So the next slide. So that one made me wonder actually, so this is another report that just came out, and today I saw that there is an OECD report that does basically claims the same thing, that there is, at least in the world of work, a lot to be expected from artificial intelligence innovations at the moment. I'm not sure what the 1/4 of current work that will be substituted, or whether there will be 300 million full-time jobs disappearing. But there will at least be quite a disruptive effect of artificial intelligence. So the next one. So what I did, I just briefly thought of these, how to not make the mistake as I'm on the pessimist and very new part of the book. I thought maybe we designed some of these scenarios that you can think of, like a dystopian one, where the labor market is seriously disrupted, and increase in technological employment will be high, and on the long term it will be chronic. The same for education. If you have been thinking about what ChatGPT already does in the higher education sector and that elsewhere, I think we can expect something there to happen, which will ultimately lead to greater inequality, because some people are very capable of using this and their skills will be rewarded, whereas others will be left behind. Same types of developments you can see in healthcare, especially given one of our contributions that has already been mentioned, that said that digital technology allows insurance companies to calculate individual risk profiles, which in the end will threaten the traditional logic of social insurance, because now you know who the good risk and who the bad risks are, and that ultimately in the longer term will really undermine social solidarity. So the next one, which is the final one, or almost final one. This is the positive scenario, because of course it all depends on how these pressures are being processed. And if it is possible that governments take this up and that politics helps, so to speak, then there could also be all kinds of beneficial impacts on the welfare state. I'm not going into all these. They are just afterthoughts in a way, in the wake of our conclusion, where we already mentioned these type of things, but not specifically related to artificial intelligence. And then the next one. So in the book we already stressed that there is nothing automatic, and Achim already said that this is a matter of politics. It is, the future is open in a way, and it depends on how people act. And we explicitly said that policymakers have more options than simply cleaning up the mess, and technologies can be regulated, and the power of new actors can be kept in check, and policies can be adjusted. But the pace of change at the moment seriously undermines, I think, even that particular part. But of course, that is completely open to debate. So where we say politics really matters, I still think that is true. But can it still matter if you see how fast these changes go? That was one afterthought that I had preparing for this. Okay, that was it. Thank you.
That was fantastic. Thank you very much, everybody. Do you want to take your slides down? If anybody has questions, please either raise your hand or put the question in the chat box, and I'll pick it up and you can ask it yourself. Well, first of all, can I say thank you very much. Wow, that was a super whirlwind tour through a massive amount of material. And one of the reasons I wanted to invite you to come and talk about the book is because of the wealth of research that's in it. And also because I felt that there are very few books at the moment that actually look at this whole issue of the welfare state and digitalization. That hasn't surprisingly received quite as much attention as Uber drivers, etc. That platform economy has received a hell of a lot of attention, but there's other areas that haven't. And that's why I wanted you to come, and because I thought you also covered a range of interesting areas from education, health, social services, income schemes, etc. Maybe I'll kick off with a question, unless anybody else has their hand up. I mean, there's so many questions I could ask you, but let me ask a simple one to start with. And let's talk about Denmark and Germany. So why is it that Denmark, given that you're talking from where you are, why is it Denmark is so much more successful in digitalization than Germany? Because you say politics matters. So why are these countries, like the Nordic countries and the Netherlands and Estonia and Spain even, they counter our conventional assumptions and understanding of comparative political economy from varieties of capitalism literature, which always, the short version of that extensive literature that we're all familiar with, you know, Germany is a coordinated capitalism, is much more effective than liberal capitalism, depending how you measure it. But when we look at digitalization, I think it is different this time. And I think it is really challenging some of the questions or established knowledge we have in conventional comparative political economy and welfare state research that tends to put, there are some countries that are basket cases, like some of the countries in Southern Europe or even Ireland. Yet when we look at digitalization, some of those countries like Spain and Ireland and Estonia are all doing very well. But some of the countries that should be doing well aren't. So I want to maybe kick off with that. I mean, there's so many questions, but Marius, you'd like to respond first of all.
It's a very good question. Maybe I can start and then the others can join in. I think with regard to the German case, I would say one has to make a big differentiation between the public sector and the private sector, so to speak. And I think the first thing I would say is that in the private sector, things are not as bad as in the public sector. So I think there are some German companies, especially if you look to this, what we call in Germany, Industry 4.0, so this complex systems, cyber physical systems, or whatever they're called, you know, stuff that Siemens and the big exporting manufacturers are producing. I think they are competitive in that area. This is the sort of the old style coordinated economy moving. It's moving slower maybe than other countries, but that's also what you would expect from a BUC perspective. This is rather incremental innovation, not so much radical innovation. So I think some of it is moving in this direction. The second thing is maybe at the same time, you know, the old industries are of course still dominant. I think you actually see that more with regard to the energy transition, which is to some extent related to the digitalization issue. And actually, in my view here in Constance, in our project, we actually took on this aspect of the green transition on board, because we think that these are basically very related labor market challenges that will significantly transform the labor markets in the next 10 years or so. And here, at least when it comes to the green transition, you could say that the strength of the old German coordinated model, namely highly competitive automobile industry and machine building industry, of course, weighing down the prospects for future, right? I mean, it's path dependency is very difficult to change all these things. So that's the second half. But when it comes to the public sector, I think a lot of it really is a combination of established bureaucratic routines, limited funding, limited demand from the consumers, I think, for digitalization. I think that's different in a country like Estonia also, where people are just more immersed in a digital culture, so to speak. And then federalism, I would say. I mean, this is a big problem in Germany. We're now trying to reform the healthcare system or the education system. It's all just a big federalist mess. So in the public sector, these things move extremely slowly. So I think it's a combination of these different things that are at play.
Okay, before I respond to you on the federalism, Achim, do you want to say what you want to say first?
Yeah, it's not important. I don't know the Spanish case too well, so I can't judge. But my feeling would also be federalism has a large role to play, and there's for some reason there's a strong political culture in Germany against revealing too much data. You know, we have been meddling around with an universal electronic health a registry of sorts where you can easily access this data. That's really hard to deal with, and I don't see this in Scandinavia, for instance. I don't see this kind of distrust in administrations using your data.
Kees, what do you think about?
Well, that is an important thing. It has to. So Denmark is quite far also in public digitalization, right? So it's not just in the private sector, and that has to do with the enormous high level of trust here in society, in each other, but also in the state. It's when I arrived in Denmark like 12, 13 years ago, I was amazed how much information the state gets us, and how digitalized this already was, and how little people actually are concerned about privacy or abuse of data. So that is this basic trust that's important. Secondly, I think for Denmark holds that there's this conviction that's quite broadly shared, that such a small country needs to continuously innovate and be ready to change continuously. And for that, Denmark made a very early start already 20, 30 years ago with a national strategy for ICT. And that national strategy included the typical coordinated economy parts, the unions, the employers, but also the state level, the national level, the regional level, and the local level, that were all included in one national strategy, which has boosted enormously. And that strategy was renewed every certain years and was constructed as some sort of a broad agreement among the major political parties. Those types of agreements, they persist over elections. So even if there's change of government, it doesn't matter. That strategy will just continue, right? So those are very important political decisions, and in this sense, politics matters, because this was a huge stimulus in terms of investment and in terms of education, and actually sort of exploiting this very high level of trust, so that you could actually do this data collection and digitalize the whole public sector. So there is no way there you can escape, so to speak, do anything on paper anymore in Denmark. Of course, there is also a drawback. That is the digital divide. There is about 20% of the population that has a tough time of keeping up or actually doing this. But their discussion is already so far that there's all kinds of policies to try to deal with this. So this is just my addition to what Achim and Marius already said on
I would agree with you, and although I want to talk to you and ask you loads of questions, I can see there's people who have some comments. I want to bring Noam and Atika in a minute, but just to respond briefly to Marius and Kees, I totally agree with what you said. If federalism is the reason why it doesn't work in Germany, that doesn't explain why it works in Spain, because Spain is a very federal country. Even my Spanish colleagues are saying, well, why are we so successful in digitalizing the public sector, much to their own surprise, because they've also been so used to saying the case of, oh, Spain is always a failure. Well, actually, on some big tech projects, Spain is really, really good. I mean, we only have to look at Telefonica and those high-speed trains that come out of Madrid. When they want to, they can do really fantastic things. But the narrative in our world of comparative welfare states has been very static and left in the past, and hasn't recognized some of these really disruptive challenges that are reordering the hierarchy of countries. But I'll leave that for another day. Noam, would you like to turn your camera on, because you've got a question in the chat, and would you like to introduce yourself and where you're from?
Hi.
I'll take a question from Noam, and then I'll take a question from Atika immediately after. Thank you.
Hi, thank you. Yeah, I'm Noam Bergman. I'm at the University of Sussex in the Science Policy Research Unit. I've just done some work on digitalization and energy and sustainability. So this is really interesting to hear your angle. My question was on the role of what sometimes are called superstar companies. You know, you have your Google, your Amazon, and other small number of very large companies which are already controlling a large part of our online digital world. I'm just wondering, you know, continuing that discussion of public and private, how their existence might affect the role of the welfare state, or the ability, the power of the welfare state to change things, and if we have to think about different forms of regulation and so on. So I just really want to hear your thoughts about that. Thank you.
Before you respond, Tika, would you like to turn your camera on and ask your question, because you've got your hand up, just to make sure I can get as many people who want to.
Oh, hello, hi everyone. Thank you for the wonderful presentation. It was very, very insightful. I'm a lecturer at the University of Essex, and my research is on the digitization of social cash programs. However, I focus on the Global South, and a lot of my research focuses on digitization of social cash payments in Pakistan, looking at the largest social cash program, which is the Benazir Income Support Program. So a lot of my research is looking at how the provision of social welfare by the government is being handed out to poor citizens there through the use of technologies, through their partnership with data identity management systems, which largely play a huge role in the identification and distribution of social cash. So, the role of national identity management systems, using biometric technologies in identifying citizens and delivering social welfare cash is really instrumental, and it's really impacting how social provision is being provided in other sectors as well, such as health, and particularly, licensing with the private sector for, getting access to bank accounts and getting access to other services as well. I don't really have a question. It's just, just wanted to share some of my experiences from my research, because, it focuses on a completely different sector. And, in my research, I've taken, the political angle as well, looking at how power is being shaped through the digitization and datafication through biometric technologies. Who are the actors involved? Who are the intermediaries? How is power affected? What are the power dynamics between citizens and the state when the digitization of social cash happens? So yeah, I mean, it's quite interesting what I've heard today. And, and I'm really looking forward to read the book. And especially, currently I'm trying to understand how, the provision of social cash would change with the application of AI, which is already being used in the program to identify citizens and to make processes more transparent. However, I think there's a lot of more research which needs to be done. Looking at, again, different aspects around AI regulation. So, I mean, it's a completely different context, and I understand, the northern, the global north is far more, I mean, there may be different processes, but, when I look at the context of the global south, I'm quite surprised to see how fast they're progressing with technologies, especially in the space of biometric technologies, and how and how they're providing exclusion and inclusion to certain segments of the society. So that's another aspect which I research on. How digitization affects data justice.
The speakers, would you like to respond to any of that, and then we can move on? I know there's some other questions possibly coming up as well. Thank you, Atika. Do you have anything you'd like to add to those two questions? Achim, you've got your hand up while you're waving at me.
Yeah, sure. I can perhaps start with the last one, since that's closer probably to my research agenda than Kees and Marius. I feel a little bit similar as what Jackie for some reason I want to speak Spanish now. I'm sorry. I just feel hard pressed to say, yeah, it's a little bit the same with global hierarchies of innovation, right? So what India did, and to a certain degree Pakistan is doing, is a gigantic investment, but also a gigantic experiment in not only social rights, but also even political rights, right? So you change the whole logic how to become a citizen of your country of sorts. And in that sense, they are by far the avant-garde here, right? Maybe some Scandinavian countries, maybe Estonia is a little bit comparable, but both to the better or worse, the disruptions and the benefits will be tremendous. So what Jackie described earlier on, when we had kind of some private remarks about this Ken Loach movie, about someone who's kind of deregistered from social benefits, I mean, this is now multiplied by many times when you think about the Indian e-citizenship of sorts, right? So these are important topics, and what I haven't really seen, what I would be interested is kind of a very aggregate study looking at what happens to coverage rates once you change or you add a digital logic to pay and registry. So I guess the World Bank must be working on this to see on average what happens, because of course, yeah, there will be newly included and newly excluded people. There will be new types of allegations of fraud, and there will be new types of empowerment of sorts. And sometimes it can be simpler. I have a Pakistani colleague who tells me that in Pakistan, very often people don't even want, not even to send an SMS to the system to get registered, because they feel that the government wants to abuse the data. So it's a little bit the same story as perhaps in Germany, maybe more extreme. So I guess in a nutshell, I think that there is some part of the book that actually speak to this more from a global south perspective, not strictly comparable, but I think some of the evolutions and trends, as I also said before, are rather faster than slower. But I'll let the others continue talking.
Kees, can I hand over to you?
Yes, so I just wanted to say a few words on Noam's question. I think it's, yes, the superstar companies are very important, and we have considered them, although there is quite a bit of attention being paid to this in the general literature, including our book on the impact on these big companies. But I think we have one chapter in the book that really considers this specifically for the educational sector, where they become very dominant, and where their 4 points of view of what education is becomes an influence in the welfare sector. I think for the other, so let's say the regulation side of the story is how influential their systems are. Is for the European countries are very dependent on what happens with EU legislation. Of course, they have to live up to the GDPR in terms of the data protection and to the Digital Services Act, and now with the Artificial Intelligence Act in the making, there will be more regulation. But how that precisely works out is still an open question in a way. Of course, it affects the role of the welfare state. If you see, the way Uber comes in a country, for instance, by just busting in and then see, how they respond, and then adjust to whatever types of responses. Well, in Denmark, for instance, Uber is just forbidden, right? So here it was an obvious where politics matters quite a bit. So this disrupts these types of sector so much that the unions had power enough to say, and also with the taxation issue at the background, that this was not allowed. But in other countries, of course, politics is different, so the impact is bigger. But I'm sure Marius has even more to say on this.
Yeah, maybe I can just add. I mean, this is an issue with the global tech companies, which we're also looking in, or which I'm also looking at in my current research. So in the survey that I mentioned we're doing, we have, for instance, attitudes of people towards global tech companies, and also things like, do people think that they undermine the welfare state, undermine national democracy, or do they rather perceive them as having a positive contribution on the economy, contributing to innovation and so on? And we haven't really done a thorough analysis yet, but what it seems to indicate, the survey data, is that people have both positive and negative views, saying it's not a simple correlation. You cannot be either a pro or against tech companies, but there are people who are both, who have this positive view, but also the negative view, so that they have maybe a little bit more elaborate or distinguished attitudes towards tech companies than others. So that's one thing. The other thing is that I plan to, this is again more future research, but I started to work on this a little bit, to look at the role of global tech companies in the education sector more specifically, because, and again, we have a little bit on this in the survey, but I want to do case studies, because at least in cases like US, but also other countries that have been pioneers in the digitalization of education, the global tech companies have become very involved in the governance of these systems de facto, by creating dependencies of public education system on basically the continued involvement and contribution of private tech companies. And I want to look at this more from the perspective of literature on business power, so that the linkage to the rise of capitalism discussion a little bit. So in a way, the lack of, or the Germany being a laggard in the digitalization of education is maybe also a reflection of the fact that company structure or business structure is not as open to these liberal or the superstar tech companies as in the United States, for instance, where they had a much easier time getting access to public education, essentially, right? For various reasons. But I think it's a super interesting topic, and we're working on it.
I haven't got any more questions that are coming up in the chat, and I think a couple of people are needing to go now, I know, immediately afterwards. So I think we'll start to wrap it up. But can I just say to all of you, thank you very much. I think this has been an absolutely fascinating presentation of your book. I think it's a really important contribution to the debate. I really like the way you present all the different scenarios, the whole question of the optimist and the pessimist. Is it something new or not new? I think I would go down and say it is new. I think, in the way, in some of the challenges it's coming out with. I think a lot of it's very overstated as well. The media absolutely loves a hype of AI is challenging our jobs. I think it's really strange, some of the responses, some leading AI engineers recently about what am I doing with my life, and then other people respond by faceplant emojis. Extraordinary way that people are communicating, highly educated people with PhDs from Ivy League universities speak like that. But anyway, there's and one of the things we had recently, we've just launched our survey in the UK, and I think it resonates with some of your work, is the actual take up of some of these technologies empirically is actually quite low. What was some of the research we found in the UK, but the companies that were taking it up were much more positive about employment opportunities. They're much more likely to invest in training and skills than companies that weren't adopting these technologies. So I think that the picture is a real kaleidoscope of experiences. And I think your research is contributing to that. It captures the vastness of the whole change, but the variation within it. So I think it's been really excellent. And I mean, there's a million things more we could say. Gemma, Gemma's got a point she wants to link up to. But can I just say, yeah, thank you very much for this fascinating, and I look forward to carrying on our conversations and hearing more about all the projects that you're going to be doing. So hopefully we can continue with that. Thank you very much, everybody. Okay, and we'll see you all after the summer holidays. Thank you.